Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. If you can hear me, just raise your hand so I can make sure our audio is working. Let's see. Hi everyone, are you able to hear me? Just click the raise hand button if you are. Great, thanks, appreciate it. All right, so today we'll get started. And today's webinar is going to be on top 10 tips for planning. So I'm Catherine Holt. I'm the community manager at fullcast.io, and my goal is to build a community of sales ops professionals like yourselves and provide resources, education, and connections for the sales ops community. So we've been doing a ton of meetups around the country, and we've also launched a Growth Ops community app. That's a platform to connect the community, to share best practices, ask questions, and help everyone grow in their careers. So today I'm joined by Quincy Darbyshire, who's one of Fullcast's business partners, and his role is to help our customers with their sales planning process. So he's working in this topic every day and has tons of experience in sales operations and planning. So this webinar will not take more than 20 minutes, but we will have some time at the end to answer questions. So if you see on your screen, there's a Q&A button, and you can use that to ask questions at any point in the webinar. And then at the end, I'll read through those and go over them. But if you do need to hop off at any time, we'll include some contact information at the end of our presentation, so you can get in touch with either Quincy or myself, and we can talk about today's material or any other questions you have. So without further ado, I'll introduce Quincy, and we'll start off with 10 tips for sales planning.
Thanks, Catherine. Hey, everyone. Excited to be here, excited to talk about sales planning. Before we get into it, I wanted to do a little bit of framing around the conversation. Some of our recent blog posts online have talked about the sales operations job cycle and all of the different functions that sales operations professionals do over the course of the year: strategy and planning, policy creation, processes, sales enablement, data, tech management, performance analysis. It's a lot of things, and as we go through strategy and planning, it's important to think about how each of these things kind of all intertwines together. So we'll mention that a couple of times as we go through. But the topic of this webinar is to go through planning tips, and let's get started. Tip number one, think customer first. So we put this as tip number one because ultimately it's most important. You hear this a lot in the sales organization, that you need to think customer first, that the customer is always right, and that getting close to the customer is most important. And in some ways, and most of ways, this starts with sales planning, and it's important to consider then how your decision impacts the customer. An example might be segmentation. So you're thinking about how to go to market with your sales reps by dividing them into different segments. Maybe you're thinking about this by geography. Maybe you're thinking about it by industry or by company size. A lot of times people think about segmentation in those different ways, but there are other ones as well. But really what we want to emphasize and what we want everyone to think about is how ultimately each of these decisions is going to impact the customer. If the decision that you're making in sales planning is not improving your relationship with the customer, if it's not making them have a better buying experience, or it's not improving your sales cycle because it's getting you closer to them because you become more of an expert in that specific customer, it's probably not a good decision to make. And so ultimately, all these other tips are important, but really thinking customer first and how your decisions impact the customer is really important. That's tip number one. Tip number two, use metrics. So sales planning is a challenging process, can be a challenging process with a lot of ambiguity and potentially a lot of emotion. You're talking to sales reps who are dealing with accounts that they might have had for a long period of time. You're setting quota that's going to determine their compensation for next year. Sales managers are evaluated based on the attainment of their teams. And so there's a lot of emotion that gets wrapped up in this, and potentially there's a lot of ambiguity when you're setting each of the segmentation lines or determining whether you're creating your go-to-market strategy in a certain way. the solution to really bring the emotion, the ambiguity, et cetera, down and to align everyone around the decision that we recommend is to use metrics. So this brings a quantitative approach rather than qualitative. It makes things a lot more objective rather than subjective. For example, are you trying to figure out how to get to a certain growth target? Use metrics there, use historical productivity, use pipeline, user close rates, make it about the numbers rather than the people, and it de-escalates and really makes the conversations a lot more productive. I used to run sales planning in a couple of different regions at Salesforce. One of the biggest metrics that we used at Salesforce was bookings potential, which was an account score that estimated the amount a business would spend on each of Salesforce's products. So for example, you're a 100-person company in financial services, we would estimate an amount that you would spend on Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, et cetera. And this was really helpful with territory creation, market opportunity, establishing resources, et cetera. And it was a metric that we could bring each of the different stakeholders around to make the planning process a lot more streamlined and objective. So really consider using metrics in all of your decisions as much as possible. Tip number 3, timelines. Create timelines. A big part of planning is just process and program management, making sure that everyone gets everything done in the period of time that it needs to get done. You have needs during planning for input from finance, from marketing, from HR, from other organizations. The output of sales planning needs to go back to finance, marketing, HR, et cetera. There are a lot of interdependencies between different people and also different processes. And so the solution really is establishing a timeline where everyone has accountability for deliverables at different points of time. So ultimately, you want to work back from what your ultimate deadline and goal is, potentially deployment of your territories and quota and compensation plans, and think about all the different processes that need to get done before that. So as an example here, we've got, in order to get to deployment, we have to do a historical performance review, market evaluation, capacity planning, and then territory building. This is could be a small part of your overall sales planning, but it gives all the stakeholders an idea of what's going to get done at what point so that there's accountability across the team. So tip number 3, create a timeline. Tip number 4, think ahead. So there's a common business analogy from hockey that talks about being able and it being necessary to skate where the puck is going, to move your organization to where the market is going, not where it is today. Sales planning is a lot about positioning your sales team for where the puck is going, and so then it's really important to think about where things will be rather than where things have been in the past. So when you're thinking about the metrics that you're going to use, you want them to be forward-looking rather than historically looking. Past performance is not equal future performance, so really look at where the market is going. Similarly with segmentation, you don't want to create segmentation that's going to hold you up in terms of providing for the market where it is in the future. Staffing your customer support team, that similarly. So really make sure you're thinking ahead rather than looking back, because sales planning is all about getting yourself ready for the future. On that topic, on the topic of planning ahead, tip number 5 talks about one tactical way to do that, and that's to overcarve your territories. So in this vein, it's important to think about what's going to happen if you potentially grow faster than you originally planned and how you'll manage to that. This is something that happened a lot at Salesforce, still I'm sure happens now as they grow as quickly as they do, as we were growing as quickly as we were. we needed to make sure that we were ready in the event that we needed to bring in additional headcount into the business, because we needed to continue to hit the targets that we were given. So say you're planning for 5 sales reps for next year. At the moment today, we'd recommend creating additional territories, more territories than you necessarily need for those sales reps today, and then sharing those additional territories with the existing sales reps. We call this overcarving territories, but what it essentially does is get you ready in the event that you need to bring in more sales reps. It'll be an easy transition for those new sales reps to take over a new territory, to take over new accounts, and it's not a roadblock for your existing reps, because you've kind of established that this is a possibility, and so everyone's kind of on the same page when it happens. So tip number 5, this is about planning for growth. It's if you can overcarve your territories, it'll help you and make sure that you don't trip up as you continue to expand your business. Tip number 6, create balance. Sales planning is a lot about aligning resources across the company, and one of the most important things to do in this process is to create balance. You want to balance your go-to-market efforts across resources. You'll have a lot of different resources. You want to make sure that you're using them each to capacity. You're not overextending your need on one particular resource over another. So balancing go-to-market efforts, similarly balancing the risk across your different markets. And a lot of times when you're creating your sales territories, this is about balancing market opportunity across your account executives, making sure that everyone has the same opportunity to hit their quota. And so creating balanced territories allows for that. There are a lot of reasons for this. There are a lot of results from doing this as well. You create a culture of accountability where everyone pulls their own weight because they've been given the same opportunity and same expectations. Similarly, creating balance allows for easier performance analysis. So say at the end of the year, you have certain territories outperforming other territories. It's a lot easier to identify the causes for that if you've made an attempt to create all of your territories equal, because you know that if they were established equal at the beginning and you have outperformance in one area over another, it's probably coming from a different variable than just the territories not being equal from the beginning. As sales operations folks know, that can be a big point of contention. Territory balance can be a big point of contention with sales reps, and in order to focus everyone on the opportunity and on really like bringing in revenue rather than is everything equal, creating balance moves the conversation towards that thing. So that's tip number 6. Tip number 7, experiment. Don't be afraid to experiment in your sales planning. We talked about this in a recent blog post about optimizing processes. An important part of sales operations is conducting experiments in small parts of the business and taking those learnings to the larger sales org. So for example, I can give some examples from time at previous companies. We went over some strategic decisions over whether we wanted to move to a hunter-farmer model versus an account executive managing both customers and prospects. That was an opportunity for us to create an experiment and try out the hunter-farmer model in one part of the business, which we did, identified that it wasn't the best way to go to market. We ended up scrapping that and not rolling it out to the rest of the company. In another example, we played with the outbound sales rep, the SDR, the BDR, and the AE ratios to see if we could make a change there that would improve our overall productivity and also improve our cost of acquisition for new reps. And we identified it to be an improvement in a small capacity, and we were able to roll that out across the business. So experimenting is definitely something that you want to think about as you're going through your sales planning process. Don't be afraid to do it. make sure you're doing it in the right way. Don't experiment on the entire business. Try a small area, and if it works, bring it to the rest of the business. If not, you didn't lose anything, but you learned a lot in the way. Tip number 7, experiment. Tip number 8, over communicate. Can't emphasize this enough. There are a lot of people involved in and impacted by the sales planning process: sales, marketing, finance, HR. We've mentioned a couple of them already. And each of those stakeholders is often doing their own planning while sales planning is happening. So because of that, and because not everyone is involved in every step of your the calendar that you've created that we mentioned back in tip number 3, it's important to over communicate and make sure everyone knows the decisions that are made in the sales planning process. So many of our clients and many of our former employers use at least weekly check-ins as a larger planning group to level set on priorities, both the decisions and then the priorities that are upcoming. And then smaller teams would meet a lot more frequently, sometimes daily, oftentimes daily, and communication would certainly happen regularly as planning goes on, so that everyone knows what's happening and can adjust their own plans to create better alignment. So can't emphasize this enough. The more communication, the better. Ultimately, it depends on your business's needs, but there's never a penalty for talking too much. On that same vein, document everything. Tip number 9 is about documentation. So at Fullcast, we take a view that if something isn't written down, if a policy isn't written down, if a process isn't written down, if an opinion isn't written down, it doesn't exist. And on a similar topic, or looking at sales planning, you need to document everything. Ultimately, you document your decisions, but document the timelines, document people's responsibilities and their thoughts along the way, so that after you implement the plan and as you're looking back on it and trying to evaluate how things are going, and then next year when you're going through the process again, or next quarter, or whenever you do your sales planning, you have something to look back on. So possible examples of when this would come up: if you have account ownership disputes, if you have compensation policies, even if you're just reviewing your overall planning process, it's important to have documents for each of those things so that you can revisit it over the course of the year. Tip number 9, document everything. Tip number 10, it pulls us back a little bit. We've talked a lot about specifics. We talked about being precise and organized in the process. This next tip acknowledges the need to stay flexible, both in your planning and then also in the plan that you create. We touched on this a little bit in tip number 5 when we talked about overcarving territories, but it's important to recognize that things rarely go perfectly to plan. Rarely do you hit the targeted revenue number every single month. Rarely does your entire sales organization stay as it started at the beginning of the year. So building in flexibility is important for your sales plan. Examples of this can be overcarving, like we talked about in tip number 5. It can be over assignment of quota, so you have some wiggle room in terms of how you're going to hit your ultimate number at the end of the year. It can be about sharing resources. It can be about a slight overlap or redundancy in work streams. All of those things are ways for you to kind of de-risk your plan's success, to make things a little bit easier for you to have success at the end of the year. So building in flexibility is really important. And we threw in a tip number 11 that's not necessarily part of the sales planning process, but we wanted to really recognize that that it's an important part of your overall sales operations cycle and relates to sales planning. Revisit your sales plan often. No plan is perfect, like we just talked about, and sometimes you need to make pivots before you expected. For that reason, we want to recommend that You revisit your plan at least quarterly, if not monthly. You'll be reviewing your monthly numbers regularly anyway. Bring out your sales plan and see how you are performing according to it. You don't need to make changes that often, but the more often you talk about your plan, the more often you recognize that that you have a sales plan, you have numbers that you need to hit, and you can revisit those the plans that you create at the beginning of the year. The better you'll be able to change your sales org, make sure that you guys actually hit your ultimate number and have success as you define it. So that's it. Those are our tips for sales planning. Think customer first, use metrics, create a timeline, think ahead, overcarve territories, prioritize balance, experiment, over-communicate everything you're doing, document, stay flexible, and revisit often. And we are more than happy to field questions now, but please also feel free to get in touch with either Catherine or myself. This is an important process that I'm sure many of you are going through right now, and if we can be of help in any way, we would love to.
Thanks so much, Quincy. So yeah, we'll just be fielding questions. If you want to hop off, feel free to, but if you want to stay for the Q&A, that's great as well. And then again, if you'd like a recording of this or want a copy of any slides, just shoot me an email and I'll get that out to you. So Quincy, we do have a few questions. So the first question we have is regarding question number 2. And the question is, what specific metrics would you recommend prioritizing?
Okay, so prioritizing for the sales planning in general. That's a good question. So I think it depends on what part of the sales planning process you're in, whether it's looking at performance analysis, historical performance analysis, or building out your capacity, understanding your capacity model for next year, or actually creating the individual territories. But the big metrics that stick out to me would be historical attainment. So how well has your Salesforce done in terms of productivity in the past 12 months? Because you want to have a baseline for performance when you're building out your capacity plan. Another one is this idea of an account score. At Salesforce, we call it bookings potential. Other companies, some of our clients just call it account score or market opportunity score. You want to have some way of evaluating opportunity at a company level so that when you create your territories, when you evaluate the market, when you try to identify how much opportunity is in a specific place, that numerical value is really important and helps make a lot of those decisions. So I'd say historical attainment and account score would be the two biggest ones, with a host of other ones along that kind of support the two of those. Great.
We have another question about kind of the bonus tip about revisiting your sales plan. They ask, how often should you revisit your sales plan? And you kind of touched on that, but I think they might be asking more along the lines of, you individually and then you as a team.
Yeah, that's a good point too. So you individually, I mean, the sales operations kind of job almost requires you to revisit your plan daily or as frequently as you physically can. You're constantly, you create a plan at the beginning of the year, but as we talked about in the sales ops job cycle, it's a continuous loop of responsibilities to create policies, processes, manage data, do performance analysis, and then compare that to your sales plan. So I'd say the more often you can do that, the better. Oftentimes we get kind of sucked into more like tactical stuff, answering tickets, moving accounts around, etc. But the more often you can compare things to your plan, the better. And almost, I'd say maybe weekly for a sales ops person. But at a high level, if you're dealing with your head of sales, if you're a public company and you have kind of quarterly results, your like high-level leadership does it a lot less often. And so monthly is generally kind of the most frequent that you would do the analysis. And then at a board level, it spikes every quarter, and at the end of the fiscal year, that's probably the most in-depth that you would be looking at your performance versus plan.
Okay, great. And we have time for one more question. So that's the question is, regarding overcarving territory, how do you recommend managing unmanned territory until you add a salesperson?
Yeah, that's a great question. You definitely do not want to just leave it unmanaged as just space that's out there. So what we did at Salesforce, and I thought it was a great practice, was we would break that unmanned territory into smaller kind of like sub-territories. If, for example, you created 6 territories for 5 sales reps, territory 1, territory 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, you would take territory 6, the unmanned territory, the overcarved territory, and you would break it into smaller territories like A, B, C, D, and E, or just 3 or 2, however much you can manage in your process, and you would share those smaller territories with each of your sales reps. So each of your reps gets an additional, say, like 20% of a territory until that new rep comes in. And I think different companies we've spoken to, different clients that we have, manage that overcarved territory slightly differently, but it's better. You'll have better productivity. You'll have better, I guess, feelings from the account executives and the sales team if you divide that additional territory up into smaller territories and split it out, so that each of your reps feels like they're getting a share of that additional opportunity rather than just assigning it to one specific person.
Great. Well, a huge thank you to everyone for staying for a Q&A, and thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll be sure to let you know when our next webinar is. I think we're looking at December 19th, and we'll be kind of doing an overview of the career ladder meetups that we've been doing this season. So we'll kind of compile all the information that we've learned from you guys and put it into a webinar. And so stay tuned. We have a lot more planned for 2019 as well, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks.